As many of you know, in our tradition, when we read from Torah, the portions aren't just divided by chapters and verses, but each one also has a name. And you may know that these names come from what is not necessarily the theme of the portion, but simply from the first word or the first significant word that we find in the portion. Now, this system tends to work pretty well. So far this year, we have started with Bereshit, in the beginning. Then came Noah, which is about Noah. Lech Lecha, which means go forth, the story of Abraham and Sarah who set out on their journey. And Vayera, which means God appeared, and that continues the story of Abraham and Sarah. And this week we read Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. But again, remember that the portions get their names not based on any kind of summation of the theme, but simply by the first significant words. And again, this often does relate to the theme, but then there is this week, Chaye Sarah. Vayihu Chaye Sarah mea shanim ve'esrim shana ve'shava shanim shnei Chaya Sarah. V'tamat Sarah be'kiryat arba hi Hebron be'eretz Canaan. The life of Sarah came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. In other words, the portion called Sarah's life, if we went ahead and added just one more word to the title, we would have Sarah's life ended. What an interesting accident that our naming convention led to this situation where a portion named after Sarah's life begins in its first lines with her death. Of course, if you are more traditionally minded, this is not an accident. The text is teaching us something. But what? The first possibility is a framing of death different than the lens we usually use. The Torah does not use euphemism to soften reality. Sarah did not pass away or pass on. She did not enter eternal rest or slip away. She did not shuffle off a mortal coil, and she did not kick any buckets. Sarah, the Torah says, died. And despite the Torah often describing dramatic events but saying little about how the people who witnessed them actually felt, in this case the Torah does give us some insight. It says that Abraham mourned Sarah, he bewailed her. Toward the end of the portion, when Sarah is but a memory in the narrative, we read of Isaac, her son. He meets his wife Rebekah on what we would think is the happiest day of his life. What does the Torah say? Isaac loved Rebekah, and thus he found comfort after his mother's death. The Torah goes out of its way to make sure we understand the death of Sarah was just as terrible for her spouse and child as we would expect it to be. The Torah doesn't soften the reality of death, nor does it imply it is anything less than final. Sarah does not ascend to heaven. She does not go to God. She does not go to Olam Haba, the world to come. What, if anything, happens to her? That is left for us to ponder. But in this moment, the Torah forces us to confront the reality of mortality. A beloved spouse, parent, friend is dead. It is harsh, it is painful, but hiding reality behind euphemism or knowing assurances about the unknown, that is not the answer. Denying death will not defeat it. The first lesson that I have just described of these opening lines, it is difficult, but ultimately helpful in allowing us to come to terms with our own mortality. The second lesson is much more troubling. The Midrash, ancient rabbinic tradition, sees Sarah's death at the start of this portion and asks a simple question. What caused it? And why now? The sages of the Midrash, they look back and notice what comes immediately before these lines. It is one of our most famous and difficult stories, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the time where Abraham comes within moments of killing his child. and stops only when a divine messenger intervenes. The Midrash from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer tells the following. When Abraham came from Mount Moriah, Satan does exist in Jewish tradition, and Satan was furious that he had failed to realize his lust to abort Abraham's sacrifice. So what did Satan do? He went off and he told Sarah, Sarah, have you not heard? No, she said. Satan continues, your husband has taken your child Isaac and sacrificed him as a burnt offering. While the boy cried and wailed helplessly, your husband killed him. Upon hearing this, Sarah began to wail. She cried 3 sobs, corresponding to the 3 tekiah notes of the shofar, and she died. Abraham came home and found her dead, which is why we read in the Torah, Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. The Midrash paints a very different view of Sarah's death. At 127 years old, according to the Midrash, she still died young, before her time. Her death was not natural. It was caused by hearing the false narrative that her husband had killed her son. Sarah died of a broken heart brought on by the actions of an evil messenger who twisted the story. Her death becomes an even greater tragedy, and the blasts of the shofar, in them the rabbis heard the sobs of a dying mother. The lesson here is words have power. They can hurt and they can even kill. We should not take what we say lightly. But the third lesson is the hardest of all. There is another midrash. It is almost the same as the first, except this time there is no Satan. This time, it is simply Isaac returning after the almost sacrifice, after the ram took his place, and Isaac tells his mother what happened. She asks a simple question. Were it not for the messenger, my son, would you already be dead? Upon hearing Isaac give the answer that she knows is coming, she screams the tekiah notes of the shofar, and she dies. Sarah's death in this telling comes not as the result of hearing a lie, but from hearing the truth. Our sages were not prophets. They did not always get it right. But writing millennia ago, they recognized a truth we still today often overlook. Not all wounds can be seen. And the ones that can't, the spiritual trauma, that is often the hardest to heal. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. Most of us would say that it is a pretty good life and leave it at that. Our tradition says something else. She died young from the pain of those who loved her most. We often understand the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, as some sort of test of Abraham's faith, as a story with a largely positive outcome. Abraham proved he had faith. His son is saved. Everyone is happy. Even on its own, this is a challenging story to read and to make sense of, let alone one to uphold and admire. But what about Sarah? Aviva Zornberg writes, for Sarah, the Akedah, it is not a test. It is not a 3-day trial of faith culminating in rescue and vindication. She, rather than Abraham, faces the full anguish of the already slaughtered one. The fact that Isaac survived, that changes nothing. So what can we take from all of this? For one, the next time we hear the shofar, perhaps try to remember what our sages heard. When they heard that sound, what they heard was an encapsulation of human suffering and anguish. It was meant for us to open our hearts to those whose hearts are broken. When we hear of a dangerous situation, our impulse is often to say, thank God no one got hurt. We mean well when we say those words. It could have been a tragedy, but thank God it was averted. The car swerved at the last moment. The EpiPen was within reach, and it did its job. The carbon monoxide detector worked. The man put down the knife. Thank God no one got hurt. But this is perhaps the greatest lesson from this tale. The next time you are tempted to say those words or you hear someone else say them, consider, someone almost certainly did get hurt. Maybe not physically, but their soul was beaten, perhaps broken. Despite what we all grew up hearing, the Akedah story did lead to death. It's just that it wasn't because of a knife. We are by nature drawn to physicality. If things look okay, we conclude they are okay. It is all too easy to mistake and to overlook pain that cannot be seen. But our sages compel us forcefully, passionately, that we must look harder. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.